The morning the men came to the tribune, Lila Hart kept her hand on the ledger and kept her face steady. She had learned to do both in the 3 years since Tom's funeral, steady hands and steadier eyes. The ledger belonged to her modest boarding house in Reed's Crossing, rent paid, names recorded, notes about the little remedies she kept behind the pantry door for coughs and fevers. She ran the boarding house, sewed quilts in the evenings, tended to wounds when Mr. Gonzalez's boys bled from a fistfight. She also wrote the column that refused to look away. That column had cost her. Where some women in town were advised, gently or otherwise, to keep their mouths shut, Lila had a stubbornness that looked a lot like indignation and a scar beneath her jaw that glinted whenever she laughed. 41 years old, and with more than one grey strand in a bun, she had the kind of face that wore a life's weather. Not soft nor hard, just honest. Her hands knew needles and scalpels, presses and ink-stained letters. She called herself a journalist because the world needed those small truths printed, but she carried a nurse's pragmatism and a housekeeper's economy. In those things lay power. The men who came to shut her paper down were deputized miners in the mining company's pay. One had Tom's ring on his finger, as if men in Reed's Crossing were trying to find ownership in dead things. Tom had been gone 3 years, gone in a night that smelled of coal and gunpowder when the shaft collapsed and the official record called it an accident. Lila had grieved and then investigated. She'd put ledger lines to storylines, traced receipts, and published the list of names paid by the Reed and Harlan Mining Company to men in town council. She'd written about illegal explosives, about ledgers that had gone missing, about a sheriff's office too cozy with corporate hands. For that, the company had lawyers. For that, the sheriff had men. "You've got to stop, Miss Hart," the largest of the deputies said, gloved fingers folded behind his back. He'd been at the mine the day Tom died, Lila knew, thumbprints of whiskey on his cuffs. "You're making trouble." "I write what I find," Lila said. Her voice did not waver. She kept the ledger open on the counter, an obvious show of proprietorship. "If the Reed Company is doing wrong, folks should know. They're powerful," the deputy said, "and a paper-stirring trouble is a dangerous spark." He nodded toward the sheriff's office, as if a mention of law was supposed to make Lila back down. She had not asked for danger, she had asked for truth. But truth in Reed's Crossing made you a target. 2 years earlier, after the funeral, a stranger had offered Lila a bundle of papers and then vanished back into the dust. Those papers were a half-burned stack of invoices and a letter signed by the company's treasurer. Tom's name was on one of the invoices. She had published what she could and kept the rest hidden, stuffed in the false bottom of an oak trunk that no one touched but her. When the sheriff's men had come to search the boarding house once, under the excuse of keeping peace, they'd taken everything except that trunk. Maybe they hadn't seen it. Maybe they'd assumed a widow could not be a cunning thing. It wasn't only Tom's death. It was the whispering at wigs and kitchen tables that tried to make Lila smaller. A widow, a woman with an opinion, a woman who would not bow to the quiet expectation of her town. The mayor's wife had called her impertinent. A churchgoer had suggested a woman's place was with prayer, not presses. Lila had kept on. She'd learned the press room like a craft, where to roll ink thin, where to rest type so letters didn't smear into accusation. She had a mind like a file and a body steady from years of lifting cots and carrying coal. But the ledger on the counter and the men at the door were not what made her chest tighten. It was the rumor that had been thickening since spring. Men who'd been witnesses were dying in the night. Miners with names in her articles, falling silent in ways that suited the company. 3 bodies in as many months. Each passed as an accident. A fall down a shaft, a cart run off its track, a heart attack at a table. Only Lila did not see accidents in patterns. Tom's ledger said so. She had been warned by a judge in a city paper once. Don't pick fights with men whose coffers buy convictions. Reed's Crossing had grit and blood, but it also had anthracite and property deeds. The company had bought men and opinions, and sometimes silence. "If you stop taking notices for the Tribune," the deputy said, tapping the ledger, "maybe you'll find folks willing to take a boarder." She hadn't been afraid, at least not in the way that makes a woman stop her mouth. Mostly she was tired of threats that smelled like promises, tired of answering to men who'd never tended a fever or written a line that mattered. She felt the ledger's weight like a heart against her palm. There was a choice to be made. The town's air tasted like coal and decisions, and then they mentioned him. "He's been seen up by the river," the deputy said. His face didn't change, but there was a tiny sneer at the corner of his mouth, as if the river hid something shameful. "Outlaws bring more trouble. They stir men, they hide papers. Folks like that only mean trouble, Miss Hart." She recognized the name before she saw the man. Jackson Reeves, an outlaw in the minstrel songs, a thief in the printed notices. There were wanted posters with his face and a price that would buy a horse. Reed's Crossing had learned to fear him because he robbed stagecoaches, and because this was the century where men prefer their villains labeled and shelved. But history is rarely one size fits all, and women who had been paying attention, women who mended seams or tended children, spoke in soft tones of the man who gave food to those ruined by the company and of the ledger he'd been carrying like talisman. "You know him?" the deputy asked. Lila's fingers tightened on the ledger. Her instinct was neither law-abiding nor reckless, but exact. Jackson Reeves had been seen with Tom the week before the collapse. Someone had whispered his name in a saloon and said he'd been asking about company ledgers. Someone had left a hat on a fence post. Someone, a woman the deputy never heard, had said he had a ledger in his saddlebag that would answer questions for a town of grieving widows. She closed the ledger calmly and tilted her chin. "If he's got the rest of what I need to prove what happened to Tom and those men," she said, "I'll meet him. I'll decide whether to trust him." The deputy's nostrils flared. It was the look of a man who believed only in rules and not in the messy business of justice. "You don't want to be seen with him. Folks will talk. Sheriff will talk." "Let them talk," Lila said. There was no more softness in her voice. There was steel, and beneath it, a woman who had been hollowed by grief and then had filled that hollow with purpose. Better to be talked about for trying than to be forgotten. She gathered her coat and her satchel of press sheets. The ledger she tucked under her arm like a foundling child. For a moment, she looked at the worn photograph of Tom pinned behind the counter, the man with calloused hands and laugh lines, and felt the weakness like an old bruise. She would not be ruined into silence. She had rights, she had goods, she had courage. And when you are a woman in a town that wants you small, making a decision is the first and most dangerous rebellion. As she stepped into the dust, she felt the weight of the ledger like a promise. Somewhere down by the river, the outlaw might have the rest of the truth. She walked toward trouble with ink on her fingers and a nurse's calm. She was going to ask a criminal for justice. That, she thought, was exactly the sort of irony the world needed. She found Jackson Reeves where the river crooned beneath a stand of cottonwoods, where sun and shadow braided leaves. He was a silhouette of a man who'd seen too much. Tall, shoulders broad in a dusted duster, face shaded by a brim that once saw law and sometimes mercy. He sat on a log, elbows on knees, fiddling with a leather-bound book. When he raised his head and looked at Lila, there was no poster-laden villainy, just eyes that had been too often disappointed by men's promises and women's tears. There was also a fire-scarred hand and a scar across his knuckle that matched the story of a man who'd been broken and made into something else. "You're Miss Hart," he said. His voice was low but not unkind. His accent had the lilt of places that were hard and honest. He set the book on his knee like it was both a relic and a weapon. "You're Jackson Reeves," Lila said. She did not throw the accusation like a rope to entangle. She slid into the moment with the practiced steadiness of someone who'd faced down threats and always kept her pulse at a useful rate. "I'd like to see what you have." He studied her as if cataloging how much danger she could hold. "Why would I show you?" "Because I'm the only one asking the right questions," she said. "Because I won't print anything that hurts innocence, and because I keep houses and I keep secrets. Because Tom's ledger is in my trunk, and there's a name in the margin that matches a list you were seen with." He let out a breath that might have been a laugh. A dozen men, all called by law or hired by company, had a single script for women who came to Outlaws, begging, bargaining, pleading. Lila did not arrive like that. She arrived like a woman with a ledger and an appetite for truth. That surprised him. "I have things," Jackson said finally. He tipped the book, and she saw pages with columns and columns of numbers, with arrows and scratchings. There were names, men who'd been paid to sign affidavits, to look away, to declare that a shaft collapsed without malice. "But the truth is heavy. If I hand it to you, the Reed boys will come hammering. They don't ask, they take." "Then give it to me," she said, "so I can choose how to use it." He watched her, the river whispering as if waiting for the verdict. "You're not bringing a posse?" he asked. She was ready to be made small. She would not. "I have the press and the people who read it, and a trunk where I keep what I can't print. I have friends, a laundress who remembers faces, a midwife who knows where secrets stay, a seamstress who can stitch a man's coat into a woman's. I can hide things in plain sight better than any outlaw." He smiled, half regret and half admiration. "You're a dangerous woman. And you might be useful," she said. The first compromise formed like a truce drawn in ink. They would trade. He would show her the book. She would help make sure the ledger's contents surfaced in ways that would not leave them both bloodied and tossed onto the road. There was a practical quality to their negotiation that felt almost domestic. Who took what risk? Who would be the mouthpiece? Who would be the shadow? The outlaw had his codes. She had hers. Together, their codes intersected like carefully laid rails. They walked along the riverbank, boots sinking into dust, talking in the careful shorthand of people who had been counted out by polite society. Jackson's story came out in fragments. He'd been a teamster once, a man with steady hands, until the company took his brother in a mine cave-in and wrote it off as misfortunate. When the company offered nothing and the sheriff's office wrote a report with neat handwriting and empty conscience, Jackson had seen justice as a farce. He'd taken to a life that made men like Reed and Harlan look nervous. He admitted to rustling from the company coffers and slipping supplies to families who couldn't buy bread. He had been careful never to kill without cause. He had never, he insisted, been the hand that silenced witnesses. Yet men labeled him for the ease of their fears. She told him, in trading pieces of her history like communion, her husband's stubbornness, the collapse, the letters that had been burned and the ones left half-burned. She told him about how the sheriff's men had poked into rooms and the mayor's wife had looked through her kitchen window like an accuser. The more she spoke, the more she felt the shape of a plan making itself. Truth printed and spread from her press, evidence supplied by his book, and a town that would be harder to browbeat once they saw the names in ink. Then the deputy's horse came thundering, a trail of dust and legal righteousness. Lila and Jackson melted into cottonwoods like two shadows and listened as the deputy barked to the river's edge and demanded the man's arrest. Reckless men who chased outlaws had a certain swagger. It was the swagger of men who believed badges and not nuance. They expected obedience. Jackson had learned to avoid them. Lila had learned to stand before them. "You miss your bed, Miss Hart?" the deputy asked when he found them. "Or do you prefer camping with thieves?" Lila's jaw set with an old stubbornness. "We prefer facts," she said. And for once, they did not match a deputy's expectation. The deputy frowned. "You're making a bad example." "Then follow a better one," Jackson told him. He stepped forward with a small flourish that was more theatrical than it needed to be and put his hand on the ledger. Lila felt the book's weight in his palm, the pages worn like something loved and cursed. "Go on," he said. "Print the truth, see what the town does." The deputy glared, but he rode off. The sheriff would be told. Men would talk. Reed and Harlan would worry. Lila and Jackson had formed an alliance neither of them had expected. She brought words. He brought evidence and roots the sheriff's men didn't know. They left the river together as strangers who had found a reason to trust each other. Not because they were alike, but because each wanted to name injustice and make it answer. Their escape from the deputy's glare was not peaceful. Men like the deputy prided themselves on making examples. They came the next dusk to the boarding house with threats and thin smiles. Lila faced them in the parlor with a calm that was honed by grief and outrage. When one of them reached for her ledger, she took his wrist and wrapped her fingers around it like a reclaiming. Her hands, steady from surgeries and small miracles, did not tremble. "You may have my ribs on paper," she said, "but you will not have my voice." The deputy left with his lip bitten and a promise he could not put on paper. Reed's Crossing hummed with rumor now about the outlaw and the woman who had asked for his help. Lila watched from her window as men in uniforms rode off, as cottonwoods swayed and the river sang. She felt both fear and exhilaration. She had asked for help, yes, but she had not ceded control. She had chosen her ally and set the terms. That night, when she placed Tom's photograph back behind the counter, she took the ledger from her trunk and set it upon the press beside the ink. The story was coming together, line by line, with both their hands at the tiller. The alliance was unlikely. It was also, she felt in the marrow, exactly the kind of alliance that would get things done. Reed's Crossing had a way of swallowing scandal and spitting out complacency, but it also had places beyond the judge's reach. Saloons that kept secrets, a washhouse where women met and told truths between wrung cloths, and a cabin outside town where the river cut the pasture in two. Jackson's camp was such a place, low and tobacco-stained, with a line of drying shirts and a lean-to that smelled of leather and gun oil. Lila had expected dirt and danger. She found instead a place that felt oddly like a second hand on a clock, steadying, necessary. She set up in a corner with a kettle and a bundle of type for the Tribune. Her presence there surprised both herself and the women who came to bring food. To them, she was no longer merely a widow who tried to be brave. She was a woman who'd put herself at risk to learn the shape of injustice. She was 39 when she met Jackson, old enough to have a practiced patience, not so old as to be brittle. She had been hurt. She was not broken. In the weeks that followed, Jackson's camp became a kind of clinic and study. Her nurse's skills found a place against the outlaw's ragged bravado. She stitched a man's thumb back together, soothed a fevered child he'd fed on the road, brewed bitter teas that coaxed coughs away. She kept a small medicines box with willow bark and comfrey tucked under a blanket in his bunk. She taught Jackson how to look at a wound, how to dress it without making it worse, how to check for infection. He watched her with an attentiveness that was rare for a man used to being watched for weaknesses instead. He learned that a finger could be steady enough to suture a man's life back together, and that a woman's hands carried stories that could not be read in poster ink. The camp also became a safe house for the ledger. Jackson's book and Lila's ledger passed between them like a baton. She transcribed what he wanted to show to the press and kept the rest tucked away in the trunk she insisted on storing beneath the floorboards of the lean-to. They took turns. She read names aloud by the light of a lantern, and he listened without interruption. The ledger, the checkered columns of numbers and bribes and dates, revealed skeletons that made the set of the sheriff's jaw slacken whenever she read passages aloud. He had instincts about concealment. He could move things at night. He knew which roads avoided the sheriff's patrols, which innkeepers were discreet. She had instincts about narrative. Who to tell first, how to set the facts like beads on a string so that the town would see what she saw. She taught him how to craft a story into a headline that people would carry like bread. Not sensational, but clear, with a lead that did not let the reader look away. He taught her how to read between the lines of company accounts, how to follow a path of payments like the thread of a net. Together, they built a method. And in the building, she found the tassels of something she had not allowed herself to feel. Companionship, not born of neediness or rescue, but of shared nights and shared risk. They were not lovers at first. They were partners, standing at the loom of a truth they both wanted woven into public knowledge. There were small intimacies that were not romantic, but which later counted. Sharing a cup of tea when dawn was raw, trading stories of childhood mischief, showing each other where scars came from. Jackson told her once about a winter he'd spent on a train in Kansas when he thought to lead a new life. He was almost a different man then, clean-shaven, with hands that wanted to build rather than take. The company had taken that chance and given him reasons to leave. She told him about Tom, how he had loved a stubborn woman and dubbed her stubbornness wit. They laughed once, quietly, at a memory of Tom dropping a pie into the yard because he'd been trying to rescue a kitten. The ledger's pages began to change the way she thought about herself. She had always been competent, good with the press, good at tying bandages, good at making tea. But competence is one thing, authority is another. Authority is standing in a court of men and naming what you know. She found that she enjoyed the craft of building argument, of making facts stare the town in its complacent face. She wrote a column called The Widow's Ledger, and it was both a condemnation and a doorway, not just for the town to step through, but for herself to cross. Her days were practical, full of small decisions that added up to reclamation. She reworked the boarding house accounts to make it profitable and fair, charging less to widows, making deals with farmers who paid partially in eggs and honesty. She tutored a girl from the schoolhouse in arithmetic and taught her how to read headlines for truth and not propaganda. She marshaled women into the Tribune's distribution network, an act that rooted her story in female solidarity. They folded papers into bundles, carried them down alleys, left them where men would notice. The women talked in kitchen corners about rights and wages, about how a ledger's name could ruin a man or liberate a widow. Their solidarity was not loud, it was a braided strength. Jackson watched these moves and learned. He saw Lila, in her starch and ink, become a commander of small operations, orders given not with a man's bluster, but with a woman's quiet that made people listen. Her appearance changed too. Where once she had worn plain calico and a cloth over her hair in deference, she now chose skirts that allowed movement, boots tough enough for riding. The shift was not vanity, it was armor. Her clothes loosened the idea that she was a thing to be fixed. There were nights beneath the lean-to's thin roof when they would go over sentences and schedules by lamplight. He would suggest phrasing, and she would correct him with a smile. He learned to appreciate the patient, deliberate cruelty of a well-placed fact. She learned that an outlaw's instincts for timing, when to act, when to hold, were as valuable as any editorial judgment. They escaped danger more than once. Once a posse rode near, and Jackson sent Lila to a neighbor's house with a sack of linens as if she were delivering goods. She spoke to the neighbor in measured tones, her voice a practiced instrument, and the neighbor banged a pot to simulate market bustle, and the posse rode past, fooled. It was theater, deception for the sake of life. And it worked, because Lila could play a role, and also because she refused to be the only one afraid. In the safe hours, she began to dream in more dangerous colors. She considered how to take the ledger public in a way that would not get them both killed. She imagined courtrooms and papers, and the mayor's wife at a sewing table, tearing out seams that had been stitched with bribery. Somewhere on a shelf in the lean-to, she kept a small bundle, a worn dress Tom had once loved, and a ribbon. When she touched it, she felt sorrow and a curious warmth. The past shaped her but did not bind her. She was still herself. Her grief turned into a map. The camp became a crucible then, where her old skills were sharpened into something else. Strategy. She no longer tended only to coughs and fever. She tended to the story like a patient who might yet walk. Jackson's outlaw past was a set of tools, but she was the mind that would turn them into justice. And that merging of outlaw craft and woman's precise mind set a new cadence in her chest. She was becoming the woman who could stand in the courthouse and not be dismissed. He told her the full story on a morning when fog lay like a shawl over the river, and the lean-to smelled of last night's coffee and newly baked bread. Jackson Reeves could have been many things: a spectre in wanted posters, a headline to frighten children, a metaphor for lawlessness. But Lila had learned to listen not for dramatic flourishes, but for the truth in small details. He told her finally about the ledger that made him into a target. Before the outlaw, he had been a man who kept ledgers the way a clerk keeps secrets. His brother had been a clerk at the mine, an austere man with a taste for arithmetic and order. When the shaft collapsed, the company had offered condolences and a small check. Jackson's brother had torn up the check and thrown it into the stove. He had walked out to the shaft and signed his name on the dead list of labor. The company's answer was a neat, sanitized report and a council who took over the mine's reputation. For Jackson, the world split. The men who could buy reputations did so, and the men who had been bought waited with mouths closed. He became an outlaw, not because he desired villainy, but because he could not abide quiet complicity. He stole what the company thought of as property: receipts, ledgers, the notes that mapped greed. In his pack were copies, illicitly obtained, hard-won, of accounts that showed secret bribes paid to officials and men who'd sworn otherwise. He'd been careful to distribute evidence where it would help the people crushed by the company. He'd passed out copies in safe houses, left notes where reliable reporters could find them. Tom had been one such man. Jackson had given Tom a copy because he saw in him a kindred stubbornness. Tom had planned to expose the list at the town hall. Someone had stopped him before then. Lila listened, pulse steady, then asked the question that mattered. Why keep these papers at all? Why not burn them and erase the risk? Jackson's eyes were steady. Because names are anchors, he said. When you put a name to a wrong, it becomes harder to sweep it away. She thought of the ledger under her arm months back, and of the trunk where she secreted things. And you think a paper will change a man who signs his name to a lie? It doesn't change him. It changes his options. If the town sees the ink, men can be called to answer. Men who've been bought can be made to speak. Lila considered the legality and the risk. She knew the law could be manipulated. Convictions could be bought by men who wrote checks. But she also knew public shame and evidence could crack the neatest facade. Her plan needed both evidence and an audience. Jackson had the ledger, she had the press. Together, they could make the town hold its breath long enough to listen. That did not mean violence was not a tool he could use. He'd broken locks and hidden men from the sheriff, but his violence was not indiscriminate. He had a code: steal from those who had stolen lives, protect those who could not protect themselves. For Lila, that meant his outlaw skills became instruments of strategic disruption rather than wanton harm. He could break into a safe and retrieve a deed. He could shadow a courier and intercept letters. He had contacts too, a few men on the edges of towns who owed him favors because he'd once saved their families from starvation. He told her how he'd come into possession of the most damning pages, a set of invoices with signatures and dates that corresponded to deaths and collapses. There were scribbled notes in the margin, names crossed, dates underlined. A deputy lieutenant's name repeated in a way that made Lila's scalp prickle. They paid a man to be silent, Jackson said, and then paid another man to write him into official safety. She felt anger carve into a steady determination. The ledger's information could not only clear Tom's name, if Tom needed clearing, but could reveal a pattern, a system of bought silence and staged accident. Her fingers brushed his hand as she accepted the book into her possession. It was a touch that said quietly, "We will do this." He raised a brow. "We will then?" "Yes," she said, "but we do it my way. We expose facts in paper and not with blood if we can help it. We use the press and the law. If men take blood, if they push, we defend ourselves. But the end we want is a town that knows." Jackson studied her like appraising a horse he might ride. There was a softness in his eyes, a respect forming. He respected her mind. He respected her refusal to be theater. She, in turn, respected the outlaw whose hands had built ways to get into places no honest man could enter. She respected his scars, his refusal to be a puppet. His past mistakes did not define him for her. His willingness to help define herself by courage drew her in. The ledger's pages became their map. Lila sat at a rickety table, ink-stained fingers marking names she would print. Jackson watched the sun line their faces, and in the quiet that passed between them, they mapped which documents could go public and which required more corroboration. If the sheriff's office were to be exposed, they needed multiple witnesses, and not only men who could be bought. They needed women who saw what men didn't, the seamstresses who mended the shirts of deputies and noticed receipts rolled into hems, the midwife who'd recorded the night a man's groan had been silenced. Lila had those connections by virtue of being a woman who kept houses and hearts. "You always meet trouble head-on," Jackson said, one dusk when she'd just come in from a long ride to a neighboring town to check a record. She'd been tired. A gal named Ruth, who ran a laundry, welcomed her into a small cottage and dried her hands over a stove. Lila smiled, a little rough. "Not always," she said. "Sometimes I meet it at the press. Sometimes I meet it with a quilt and a knife." She meant it as humor, but her hand found the knife in the drawer with the familiarity of a woman who knows the difference between sewing thread and a threat. He had a habit of listening for what was said between lines. He had a knack for timing, for when to ride into a courier's path. He had created a network that would, when called upon, find men who could corroborate the ledger's dates. She, the journalist, had the ears of the towns she had served. Together, they formed an architecture of exposure. He grew into his usefulness without stealing her agency. He never made decisions without asking. He deferred when she wanted the Tribune to run a headline. He stood in the background when she stood at the printer. In bed, after long days of cataloging names without sleeping, she found him looking at her full on, as if trying to understand which parts of her grief were armor and which were still raw. He learned to leave space for both. The sheriff's men began to look nervous. Reed and Harlan sent a man to town with a polite smile and a briefcase. Lila watched him at the post office, watching her as if she were something to be measured and contained. She wrote 2 columns that week, one about the miners' union and the other about a man who smiled too well. She printed Jackson's ledger excerpts with careful redaction, leaving the most explosive names for the day they could not be ignored. And when finally the deputy who had threatened her at the press came to the lean-to with a posse, they were waiting. Not with weapons first, but with witnesses. Lila had, in a quiet campaign over months, built a framework of women and honest men who would speak. They stood at the lean-to fence that afternoon as if the whole town were a jury. Jackson stood beside her, pistol at hip, but not in front of her. The day that action started, his outlaw past served her present. He had taught her how to read the roots of couriers. She had taught him how to ask a woman a question without sounding like a man who expects a yes. They were learning to trust each other's strengths. She translating his dirty deeds into public fact. He translating her words into safety. Her truth came with names and smells, the oil-slick ledger pages, the sulfur of explosives, the iron scent of blood in a miner's palm. Lila had been raised on porch swings and hymnals, taught to finish a hymn and say a prayer. She had married Tom because he could fix a leaky roof and because he read aloud with a voice thick with warmth. His death had been the sort of violence Reed and Harlan would bury beneath the daily grind of labor. Tom's grief had become her work, and it was not content merely to be mournful. She was angry, but anger gave way to purpose. She wanted not only to clear his name, but to set wrongs to right. The corruption had fingerprints as common as coal stains. The sheriff's office had a ledger of its own, she discovered, where payments were tallied against names of men who must be kept silent. The Reed Company had a ledger. Men on the town council had blank checks written with the company's pen. The danger was that Rust and Harlan wouldn't need to shout. They would have men who counted on their wages and would sign away justice for a coin and a nod. When Lila wrote about it, she felt the heat of a woman naming names. She imagined her words like a net. If enough people read it, one of two things would happen. Either the company would fall into retrenchment and pay fines, or it would try to silence her, and then the town would have to decide if it would let such violence be normalized. The decision had to be hers. She could not let a man, outlaw or official, choose for her whether she would speak. She chaired the plan for exposure, gather testimony, corroborate invoices, make prints of the ledger. She assigned roles. A midwife would attest to a night when a man's groan from the jail had been smothered. A seamstress would show a roll of labeled receipts hidden in a mayor's coat. A laundress would attest to a deputy's small finger inked with company checks. These were female witnesses. Their testimonies mattered as much as any man's affidavit. And the stakes were not merely reputational. Men who had been too poor to make their own case to the company had been killed or driven to flee. Lila was not interested only in the ledger's legal ramifications. She wanted to restore land, wages, and dignity. She saw a future where widows like herself could own property and be free of the company's indentured custody. She wanted Tom to mean more than a footnote. She wanted his name to be a pivot. Jackson respected her plan, but did not romanticize it. He had seen blood, and not all truth must be crowned in a courtroom. Some truths required a rope and fire. He deferred to her judgment about tactics. When the ledger's most damning name turned out to be the deputy lieutenant who had failed to respond at collapses, Lila insisted paper first. "We make men speak here," she said. "We do not let them shut mouths with a bullet." They corroborated witnesses the old way, quietly, in kitchens and at the back of a church where men thought prayer would suffice to make them unseen. Lila sat with women over lamplight and wrote down scrap memories. The deputy's late-night visits to the mine, the way he paused at a widow's gate, the way he had a habit of leaving with a pocket lined with company notes. These were not showy. These were the bones that would support a structure of proof. The final piece she needed was a confession, some link that showed the company's hand in instructing men on which accidents to orchestrate. It came not as a dramatic affidavit, but as a torn page brought by a man who'd been a clerk in the sheriff's office. He'd been bribed, then he'd been frightened into silence. He left a page, half-burned, that had names inked in a hurried hand. It was evidence of not only payments, but order. Lila read it with a steady voice, and Jackson listened as if the ledger had been a confession in his own language. But she could not ignore the cost. Her plan required that she risk everything: her house, the mail route that fed her borders, and her personal safety. The sheriff's men might come for her ledger, and Reed and Harlan might send men to the boarding house to take it and burn it beneath her feet. The mayor had a lawyering habit that could strip her of property with a page and a signature. All of that did not matter as much as the women who had told her their story. They had put their names and reputations at risk. She had to run with that trust. There were nights when she lay awake and felt the tilt of fear. Fear is a partner as honest as courage. It tells you where the ache is. But it did not make decisions for her. She had been told by a cousin that some women accepted privacy as a form of safety. Lila did not believe in acceptance when the price of acceptance was another widow's silence. She chose risk and set a deadline for herself. The day of the mining company's annual meeting, she would publish the ledger's summary. The town would have to answer. Jackson never tried to hold her back. He tightened his belt and his jaw and asked only one thing: that she allow him to manage the movement of papers and the protection of witnesses. She granted him that because she knew how to delegate and because she trusted his network. They formed a small band, women on the inside and men on the periphery, who would be the spine of the coming case. When the day came, she published a detailed piece under the heading, "The Ledger of Reed and Harlan." It ran on the front page with the sober illustration of a ledger and the embossed ink of a man's fear. The town read it over breakfast, bread and ink, and some men spat. There were denials and threats, but the piece had teeth. Names were out there, and names are stubborn things. She felt the room tilt when she mailed it, and then set about a steady routine of check-ins and witness protection. She could not forget why she did it. For Tom, for the men who had been forced into silence, and for the women who had lent their voices without expecting reward. The ledger had cost her peace. It was buying her a future. But peace was not what justice had required. Justice had required a voice, skill, and the willingness to stand in the light with a pen trembling but true. They planned like captains drawing chart. The autumn light cropped the lean-to in gold and shadow as they spread papers on a table and argued over phrasing. Lila had always believed in precision. Jackson had always believed in timing. Together they made a map that was both cunning and morally exact. Their strategy had three axes: secure witnesses, obtain the company's private books, and force a public reckoning with undeniable evidence. She taught him the art of an editorial, how to begin a column so that the reader's attention is arrested without cruelty, how to let the facts be the moral center. He taught her the logistics of moving evidence, how to remove a ledger page without leaving a trace, how to make the sheriff's men follow a false trail. Each lesson was an intimate exchange of trust. Their romance grew in the quiet places of learning, his hands steady on a saddle as she fitted a seam, her laughter at his clumsy first attempt at printing type, his hand finding her wrist in a city she had never imagined holding him in. Their equality was deliberate. He never took the lead without asking. She never acted without informing him. When a courier needed to be intercepted, he conferred with her on the ethical line between subterfuge and theft. When she had to protect a woman who contradicted a deputy, she asked his counsel on how to remove the woman from town without endangering her family. They had differences. He could be fatalistic, she stubbornly idealistic, but their differences were a balance. He softened her sharpness with practical patience. She made him see that theft alone could not build a future. It could only steal a moment. They healed each other in odd ways. Jackson had a temper that had been shaped by loss and by men who took advantage. He was learning to pause as she had learned to wield argument rather than anger. She, who had been so steady with scalpels, learned to let go at times, to allow herself to laugh without fearing it would seem frivolous. They taught each other skills that were not the ones they came with. He learned to read ledgers as if they were confessions. She learned to ride the ridgelines for hours without thinking of homesickness. Women rallied. Lila's boarding house became a center of operations. Ruth, the laundress, kept a ledger of which men visited when. Mariah, the midwife, stored evidence in crib slats. The seamstress, Beatrice, sewed notes into the hems of coats and pockets where searching men would ignore the truth. These acts were not romanticized heroism. They were everyday courage. They did the small, invisible work that made a big reveal possible. Jackson's contacts did the outside work, watching, intercepting, and, when necessary, distracting. He recruited men wronged by the company who had not yet given in to fear. There was one man, Elias, who had his hand crushed by a cart and had been given nothing. Elias would not speak in court out of fear of reprisal, but he would ride with Jackson to a safe county, and there he would sign an affidavit hefted with truth. Lila and Jackson grew into romance without surrender. The first time they kissed, it was an agreement of mutuality, not a declaration of ownership, but an exchange of warmth on a night when frost had crusted the river and the world was only white and breath. They stood by the lean-to stove, hands hesitant, words unnecessary. He did not try to fix her. She did not expect him to. He learned to admire her anger. She learned to respect his scars. Their partnership was an equal shelter. Together, they smoothed out the plan. She would publish a serialized piece, dropping evidence in installments so that the town's curiosity would be whetted and then informed. Jackson would make sure the books they needed would be accessible at the town hall vault during a celebration when most men were distracted. They would also ensure safety for the witnesses during the reveal. Lila's idea involved a public read. She would arrange for a town meeting, and she'd read aloud the ledger's entries, pausing to let names sink in. The memory of Tom would be invoked not for cheap sentiment, but as a pivot for collective action. And there was love in the practicalities, in the way Jackson learned to iron her shirts, and she learned to oil his rifle. It was not about control, but about respect for the other's independence. He taught her how to track the time of a courier's trips. She taught him how to ask a question that could break a man's silence without letting blood be shed. They argued, sometimes heatedly, about methods. He once suggested a nocturnal break-in at the company office. She rejected it because it risked the lives of the women who would be witnesses. He yielded, not as a defeated man, but as one who respected her calculus. She yielded too on occasions where his experience proved practical. They also corrected each other's blind spots. Jackson had been raised by men who thought nothing of using a woman's fear as leverage. He had to be taught that a woman's resolve was not to be tested. Lila had been schooled in the theory that emphasizing a woman's feminine cunning was sometimes the only way to get men to listen. Jackson showed her that showing strength openly could work as well. They came to recognize that each had a place at the table, and that the table itself was theirs to move. Emotional intimacy grew like vines on a trellis, slow, persistent, entangling but not constrictive. They made jokes that belonged only to them, ridiculous rhymes about ledger columns and the way the sheriff miscounted his tobacco. They spoke of futures as if lightly stitching a pattern, perhaps a printing press of their own, perhaps land redeemed for widows, perhaps a school where women taught the next generation how to read a ledger for truth. The idea of a life together hovered, not as a prize he had won, but as a possibility they might both choose. And yet, reality was never far. Each night, the town's hum included the thrum of worry. Men in suits visited the saloon and whispered of bloodlines and property. The sheriff's men scrutinized faces as if seeking guilt. Reed and Harlan began to push back with vehemence. Lila printed more and more carefully, and Jackson intercepted more and more couriers. They had planned and then planned again. Equal partnership was more than romance. It was a shared armor, each plate forged from the other's best metals. But metal grows hot in a fever, and they both sensed the temperature of the town rise. They had until harvest to make their case public in a way the company could not smother. The town began to divide like a seam pulled, some siding with the company's promise of wages, some with the widows and miners who wanted dignity. Lila stood at the center of that seam, a woman refusing to be a simple thing. She had chosen this life. She had chosen Jackson. Both choices were hers, and in that certainty, she found courage. The harvest brought a brittle light to Reed's cross. Men moved with the urgency of reaping, and the town felt split into two pulses, one for bread, one for truth. Lila sat in the Tribune's cramped office and turned over the pages of the ledger like a surgeon testing for a fracture. The paper smelled of river silt and old ink, of nights spent by lamplight. She could keep small victories, quietly force a deputy to resign, push an editor's caution to the back page. Or she could make a public movement to bring the company down with the force of a town's outrage and risk everything. The decision pressed on her like winter on corn. It was not merely a choice between safety and risk. It was a decision about who she wanted to be. If she fled, took a stagecoach west, started a new life under a different name, she could be free of Reed and Harlan's pressure. Her boarding house would be sold. Tom's photographs would be boxed. She could be anonymous and perhaps content. But the faces of women who had told her their stories would haunt her. They had put trust in her because she was a person who kept promises. Leaving them would feel like a betrayal. Jackson watched her struggle without pressing her. That was what differentiated him from other men in her life. He offered counsel, but did not press a claim that would make her sacrifice herself for a man. He said simply one cold evening, "You must decide on what terms you'll be brave." She thought of the prints she'd tucked away in the press, photographs of miners' hands folded into bundles. She thought of Tom's laugh etched in a faded snapshot. She thought of the ledger's names fading in corners, but crisp where it mattered. She pictured the town hall on the day of the hearing, people gathered, and her voice raising the ledger like a stand. She saw Jackson at her side, but not before her, watching the reaction of men who had never been held accountable. She let herself imagine a small domestic happiness too, the books of a paper where justice was printed, a house with a small garden, a man who would both love and respect her. She imagined being 20 years older and still a force in the paper, teaching a younger woman how to set type and how to read between lines. She could picture a life where she and Jackson ran a press in a town where women stood in the front of the courtroom when necessary. For a moment she considered the alternative, a quiet life of safety in a town that did not know truth better than lies. She rated the cost: security in exchange for silence, comfort in exchange for jousts of conscience. She could not accept that. "Then do it," Jackson said the next morning as they rode out together toward the neighboring county to fetch corroborating evidence. They rode side by side, their horses keeping a rhythm. He saw the choice hanging over her like a ravenous cloud and offered a steady hand. "Make the call that will leave you proud when you're old." She looked at him then, and the image of a life as a woman with names and a press rose. She loved the man because he trusted her judgment. That trust asked something of her, to make a choice not only for herself, but for the communal future she was weaving. She did not make it lightly. She was going to stake her life on truth. Her choice was public. At the council meeting, where the Reed Company planned to award itself a plaque for community investment, she walked in with witnesses at her back. She read the ledger aloud into the air that had been conditioned to worship. Names fell into the open like stones. Men paid to look away, men rewarded for silence. She did it with no dramatic flourish, only exactness. She read invoice numbers and dates and the small, damning notes written in a clerk's cramped hand. The town listened, the same people who had once bought the company's cunning listening now to a woman who had the patience for evidence. The sheriff's face went red and then pale. The mayor tried to intervene with civility, to call for a recess. But the ledger was there, and the faces of widows and miners were watching. Men who had once shrugged at payments now squinted at the pages and felt the ache of being complicit. The company's men hissed at her back and left their seat in the hall, like men leaving a stage embarrassed by the audience. The choice she made that day was not only a defiance against Reed and Harlan. It was a decision that she would not be a woman who erased other people's suffering for the sake of her own safety. She chose to be brave because bravery had weight and consequence she wanted to bear. She chose to stand with her neighbors and to make them face the ledger. After the meeting, threats came in more serious shapes. Anonymous notes, a rock through a window, a deputy's hand brushing cold across her collar like a promise. Lila tightened the ribbon she kept in her hair, the one Tom had bought her on a Sunday fair. It was hers, a small relic that connected the woman she had been to who she was becoming. She chose justice, and men would answer to the ledger's litany. Jackson's love was not possessive. He did not crow when she chose the bigger danger. He only slowed the world at her side and promised a shield. He rode with a resolve that matched hers, and together they rode into a town half convinced, half terrified of what the truth would mean. Their fantasy of a future pressed against the present, like a promise that must be fulfilled. They had the right to imagine joy. They had the duty to make the ledger's names speak. The town that once hummed with industry and small talk began to split like a seam under strain. The Reed and Harlan Company did what companies with resources do. They fought to protect their interests. They hired lawyers who could make a page read like absolute. They sent men with heavy boots to haunt the periphery of Lila's boarding house and placed a watch on Jackson's usual rides. Broader forces moved in. An angry editor in a city paper published a smear that painted Lila as a woman driven by grief and vendetta, not justice. The sheriff called in favors from neighboring counties, and men with cold eyes started to linger in. Lila felt the pressure not only as an external force, but as a coil tightening around her daily life. Her boarders, widows and women who had little to spare, felt the economic reprisal. Peddlers who sold to her began receiving threats, and the town's bank considered freezing her accounts on a pretext. Reed and Harlan's muscle was not only in steel and coal. It was in whispers and in the way a few men with coin could make a woman's life precarious. Jackson's past threatened to complicate things. A bounty hunter from the West, an old adversary with a ledger of his own about Jackson's transgressions, showed up in town with the intent of turning him in. He came with guns and a grudge. For 48 hours, it felt like the specter of violence would eclipse the careful legal approach Lila had been cultivating. Reed and Harlan did not care how many men they used to push her into silence. It was all business to them. But the worst force was not the hired. It was the subtler corrosion of loyalty. The clerk, whom they had thought secure, was seen buying bread with the same money that had once been a bribe. He refused to testify, not because he had no conscience, but for the sake of his own family. A man Lila had trusted as a likely ally grew into silence when his daughter was threatened with eviction. Fear had a gravitational pull that made confidences heavy and courage rare. It was then that female solidarity became more than a motive. Ruth the laundress organized a rotating watch system so that women would be ready if men came with ill-intent. Beatrice the seamstress, whose nimble fingers had once hidden notes in hems, now fashioned a set of false compartments in trunks to move evidence. The midwife, Mariah, kept her clinic open at odd hours so witnesses could be moved safely. These women made themselves visible in plain places so the sheriff would think twice before sending men to harass them. They were not acting in the theatrical way of legends. They were organizing tea-time diversions and convincing the baker to store crates tucked with ledger paper. Jackson used his network. His contacts tracked the bounty hunter and handled him with a deftness that came from being an outlaw, long enough to know which fights were worth the cost. He outmaneuvered men who thought they could scare a woman into submission by threatening to make her life uncomfortable. He found ways to make the tried-and-true mauling of reputations pay the price in court. He did not use brute force unless necessary. His outlaw past was a set of tools he deployed with discipline and deference to Lila's decision. Reed and Harlan escalated in a more strategic way. They began trying to use legal instruments, claiming Lila had published false accusations and threatening libel suits that could bankrupt her. They started a campaign of character assassination, hiring an attractive telegrapher to spread rumors in town about the widow who consorted with criminals. Someone defaced Tom's grave with a smear of tar and cane. These moves were designed to make Lila look unhinged and to turn her neighbors away. They assumed that small crimes would drown the larger ones. The pressure took its toll. One night, after a rock crashed through her boarding house window and a smear of tar had been smeared on her doorstep, a boarder whispered in the kitchen that she was leaving. "My children need quiet," she said. I cannot stand men watching the door. Lila's hands clenched, but she did not flee. This was the moment Reed and Harlan counted on. Sow enough fear in a town and watch the courageous few be ground down. Instead, she called for a meeting. She stood in the Tribune's office and spoke plainly to the women. She said that fear was a weight, but not a reason for surrender. She said the ledger was real and meant to restore a town's dignity. And if they all wanted that, they had to choose the risk together. She didn't romanticize bravery. She spoke of logistics and contingency. The women, many of whom had been bided down by quiet lives, found the courage to say yes. When the sheriff's men attempted to arrest a witness on a petty charge to prevent testimony, the women swarmed the jail with petitions and a caravan of laundresses holding soiled sheets as a symbol of their labor. They were not a mob. They were a chorus.